Welcome to BeFM Drama, where all this week we've been following the story of The Engineer's Thumb, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery by Arthur Conan Doyle. Victor Hatherley, a young hydraulic engineer who arrived at Dr. Watson's office with his left thumb brutally chopped off, is telling the story of the mysterious commission that led to his injury. Hired by the sinister Colonel Stark, Hatherley is on a midnight mission to a semi-abandoned country house where he's preparing to examine the strange hydraulic machinery that he's been tasked with repairing. Hatherley followed the colonel and his fat manager as they led the way upstairs by lamplight. It was a labyrinth of an old house, with corridors, passages, and narrow winding staircases. There were no carpets and no signs of any furniture above the first floor. The plaster was peeling off the walls, and mold was breaking out in places in green, unhealthy blotches. Hatherley tried to put on as unconcerned an air as possible, but he had not forgotten the warnings of the woman and kept a keen eye on his two companions. Ferguson, Stark's manager, appeared to be a morose and silent man. Finally, Colonel Lysander Stark stopped before a low door, which he unlocked, revealing a small, square room. Ferguson waited outside, and the colonel ushered Hatherley inside.
We're now actually within the hydraulic press, and it would be a particularly unpleasant thing for us if anyone outside were to turn it on. The ceiling of this room is actually the bottom of the descending piston, and it comes down with the force of many tons upon this metal floor we're standing on. There are small lateral columns of water outside which receive the force, and which transmit and multiply it in the manner that's familiar to you. The machine operates readily enough, but there's some stiffness in the action, and it has lost more than 20% of its pressure. Perhaps you'll be good enough to look it over and to show us how we may set it right.
Hatherley took the lamp from Stark and examined the machinery very thoroughly. It was a gigantic press, capable of exerting enormous force. When Hatherley switched the machine on, he knew at once by the whishing, screeching noise that there was leakage in the mechanism, regurgitating water up through a side cylinder. Once Hatherley determined which cylinder was the cause and examined it, he found that one of the India rubber bands which sealed the head of the driving rod had shrunk and become brittle, not quite filling the socket and permitting leakage. This was clearly the cause for the machine's loss of power. Hatherley pointed out the flaw to his companions, and they followed his advice carefully, asking practical questions about how to fix it. Once Hatherley had made his instructions clear, he returned to the main chamber of the press to satisfy his own curiosity about the machine's purpose. It was obvious at one glance that the story Stark had given him about Fuller's Earth was a total fabrication. It was absurd to believe such a powerful engine could be intended for the inadequate purpose of pressing clay into bricks. He felt angry at having been tricked by so elaborate and unnecessary a story. The walls of the chamber were wood, but the floor was a large metal trough, and when Hatherley knelt to examine it, he could see a thick crust of shining metallic deposit left all over its surface. He was scraping at this to see exactly what it was when he heard a muttered exclamation and saw the cadaverous face of the colonel staring down at him.
What are you doing there?
I was admiring your Fuller's Earth. Honestly, Colonel, I think I would be better able to help you with your machine if I knew its real purpose.
The instant Hatherley uttered the words, he regretted the rashness of his speech. Stark's face set hard, and a hateful light sprang up in his gray eyes.
Very well. You shall know all about the machine.
He took a step back, slammed the door of the chamber, and turned the key in the lock. Hatherley rushed towards it and pulled at the handle, but it was firmly locked. He hammered the door with his fists, but it did not give it the least to his kicks and shoves.
Hello? Hello, Colonel? Let me out!
Suddenly, in the silence, Hatherley heard a sound which sent his heart into his mouth. It was the clank of the control levers and the screeching swish of the leaking cylinder. The colonel had started the machine with the engineer locked inside. The lamp still stood on the floor where Hatherley had placed it to examine the trough, and by its light he saw that the black ceiling was coming down on top of him, slowly, jerkily, screeching, but, as he knew well, with an unstoppable force that would, within a minute, grind him into a shapeless pulp of blood and bone. He threw himself, screaming, against the door and dragged at it with his nails.
Stark! For the love of God, let me out!
But the remorseless hissing clank of the machine drowned out his cries. The ceiling was now only a foot above his head, and with his hand raised, he could feel its hard, rough surface. It flashed through his mind that the pain of his death would depend very much upon the position in which he met it. If he lay upon his face, the weight would come down on his spine, and he shuddered to think of that dreadful final snap. Maybe it would be easier the other way, with the press on his belly and face, but did he have the nerve to lie there, looking up at that deadly black shadow wavering down upon him? He was already unable to stand erect when his eye caught something which brought a fresh gush of hope back to his heart. It was a thin line of yellow light between two of the boards in the wooden walls, which broadened as a small panel was pushed aside. For a moment he could hardly believe what he saw, but the next instant he threw himself through and lay half fainting on the other side. The panel closed behind him, but the smashing sound from his lamp and the clang of the two huge slabs of metal coming together told him how narrow his escape had been. He felt a frantic plucking at his wrist and looked around to find himself lying upon the stone floor of a narrow corridor, with the mysterious woman bending over him, tugging at him with her left hand and holding a candle in her right.
Come, come! They'll be here in a moment. They'll see that you are not there. Oh, do not waste time, but come!
This time Hatherley did not scorn her advice. He staggered to his feet and ran with her along the corridor and down a winding stair, which led to another broad passage. Just as they reached it, he heard the sound of running feet and the shouting of two voices from the floor above. The woman stopped and looked around, then threw open a door into a bedroom. Hatherley could see the moon shining through the unbarred window.
The window is your only chance. It is high, but maybe you can jump.
As she spoke, a light sprang into view in the passage behind them, and Hatherley saw the lean figure of Colonel Lysander Stark rushing forward with a lantern in one hand and a weapon like a huge butcher's cleaver in the other. Hatherley ran across the bedroom, flung open the window, and looked down into the garden, so quiet and sweet in the moonlight. It was nearly a 10-meter drop. Without thinking, he clambered out and dangled from the windowsill. He hesitated to jump until he heard what passed between the woman and the madman who pursued him. If she were abused, he was determined to help her. The woman met the colonel at the door and tried to block his way, but he pushed past her.
Fritz, remember your promise after the last time. You said it would never happen again. He will be silent. Oh, he will be silent.
You are mad, Elise. You will be the ruin of us. He has seen too much. Let me pass.
He threw her to one side and rushed to the window. Hatherley was just preparing to drop, dangling by his left hand from the windowsill, when the colonel cut at him with his huge weapon. He was conscious of a dull, deep pain. His grip loosened, and he fell into the garden below. He landed in a bush and was not badly hurt. He picked himself up and began to run as fast as he could. As he ran, however, a deadly dizziness and nausea overcame him. He glanced down at his left hand, which was throbbing painfully, and saw for the first time that his thumb had been cut clean off and that his blood was pulsing out in jets from the wound. He tried to tie his handkerchief around it, but there came a sudden pounding buzz in his ears, and the next moment he fell in a faint among the rose bushes. How long Hatherley remained unconscious he could not say, but it must have been a long time, for the moon had sunk and the morning was breaking when he came to himself. His clothes were all soaked in dew, and his coat sleeve was drenched in blood from his wounded thumb. The awful throbbing pain of it brought back his memories of the night, and he sprang to his feet with the feeling he might not yet be safe from the terrifying colonel and his cleaver. But when he looked around, he discovered, to his amazement, that neither house or garden were visible. He had been left lying beside a hedge near the high road, and just a few steps down the road, he saw the very station he'd arrived at the previous night. Were it not for the horrifying wound on his hand, all that passed during those dreadful hours might have been an evil dream. Half-dazed, Hatherley walked into the station and asked for the morning train. The same porter was on duty from the night before, but when Hatherley asked if he had ever heard of Colonel Lysander Stark, he shook his head. Hatherley asked if there was a police station nearby, but the closest was 3 miles away and far too far for him to walk, weak as he was. Hatherley decided to wait until he got back to London before telling his story to the police. When he asked for a doctor at Paddington, the station guard recommended me. And so it was that Hatherley came to lie before us on the sofa in the sitting room of Sherlock Holmes, telling us his story. And we'll hear the end of that story tomorrow. From our studio in Busan, I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell.